I woke up at 6, 8 inches the morning, same as I had the 3 mornings before, and I lay there staring at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like the state of Florida, listening to a motorcycle cough itself awake somewhere on the other side of my bedroom wall. Then the gate. That metal gate next door had a particular sound, a scrape and a clang, like somebody dragging a folding chair across a tile floor and then dropping it. After the gate came voices, not shouting, just talking. The way people talk when they've been up for a while already and have things to do. A woman's voice, low and quick. A man's voice answering something short. Then a laugh. Bright and sudden, gone as fast as it came. I lay there with my arms crossed over my chest like I was already laid out for my own funeral, and I thought, not for the first time that week, that I had made a 4,000-mile mistake. Here is the thing nobody tells you about renting an apartment for $450 a month. $450 a month is a wonderful number. I had done the math sitting at my kitchen table in Georgia so many times that I could have recited it in my sleep. What I paid for my little rental back home, what I paid for insurance, what a jar of decent mayonnaise cost by that point. What my heating bill did to me every February and $450 a month, all inclusive, water included, felt like somebody had reached down out of the sky and handed me back 15 years of my life. I had signed a 3-month lease on that apartment with something close to triumph in my chest. I remember thinking, well, Dorothy, you finally did something smart. And by 6:08 on my 4th morning, I already had 4 other apartment listings open on my phone. I want to be clear about something before I go any further, because I don't want you thinking I'm the type of woman who complains for sport. I am not delicate. I ran a hospital admissions department for 26 years. I have told grown men twice my size that no, they may not go back to intensive care until visiting hours, and I have made it stick. I raised a daughter mostly by myself for a stretch in there and buried a husband and paid off a mortgage, and none of that made me the sort of woman who falls apart over noise. But I had never in my life lived so close to other people's lives before. Not really. Back home, my nearest neighbor's driveway was 40 feet from mine, and half the time I only knew they existed because I saw their car pull in around 6. Here, I could hear a spoon hit the side of a pot. I could hear someone's flip-flops on tile. I could hear that particular morning what I was fairly sure was somebody frying something and a rooster 2 or 3 houses down doing what roosters do, and underneath all of it, that motorcycle engine, revving twice and then settling into a steady idle before it finally pulled away down the lane. If I'd packed up that week and moved into the quieter, newer building I'd already circled online, and Lord knows I came close, I never would have found out that the very racket keeping me up at 6 in the morning would end up being one of the reasons I stayed in that apartment at all. I didn't know that yet, lying there on my 4th morning. All I knew was that I was tired and irritated and wondering whether $450 was worth what felt like living inside somebody else's kitchen. Before I get into how I ended up in the Philippines in the first place, let me just say, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and tell me in the comments what country you're watching this video from. I always like seeing where everybody's writing in from. Now, back to it. I suppose the honest answer to how I ended up on the other side of the world starts about 1.5 years earlier at my kitchen table in Georgia, doing arithmetic I already knew the answer to before I finished it. My income was $1,720 a month, give or take, between Social Security and the small pension I'd earned from the hospital system. $1,720. I want you to sit with that number because it's not a poverty number and it's not a rich number. It's a number that used to feel like plenty and somewhere in the last several years had quietly stopped feeling like plenty without me ever noticing the exact day it happened. Rent on the little house I was in, I downsized after Robert passed, moved into something smaller and easier to keep up, was $610 a month, which back when I signed that lease had seemed downright reasonable. Then there was the electric bill, which in a Georgia summer could run you $180, $200 some months because you are simply not going to sit in that heat without air conditioning, not at 78 years old, not with my blood pressure. There was car insurance. There was the health insurance premiums that supplemented my Medicare because I had seen enough hospital billing in my career to know better than to go without a supplement. There was groceries, which had gotten to be a genuine insult. I stood in the cereal aisle one Tuesday, holding a box that cost $6.19, and thought about walking straight back out of that store without buying a single thing, just out of principle. By the time you added it all up, housing and utilities and insurance and groceries and gas and the little unexpected things that always come along a car repair, a dentist bill, a new pair of shoes. Because the old ones finally gave out, there wasn't much room left. Not for saving, not for surprises. Some months, there wasn't much room left, period. I was not desperate. I want to say that clearly because I know how these stories can start to sound, like some poor old woman scraping by on cat food. That was not me. I had a little bit put away, not a fortune, but something. I could pay my bills. I was not going to lose my house. But I looked at that number, 1720, and I looked at how thin it was stretching. And I thought about what it was going to look like in 5 years, in 10 years if I lived that long, with prices doing what prices had been doing. And I did not like the shape of it. I also, if I am being completely honest with myself, did not like the shape of my days. I woke up. I made coffee. I did whatever Aaron needed, doing the pharmacy, the grocery store, sometimes just driving around because I needed to be somewhere other than that house. I came home. I watched some television, the kind where you can't really tell me afterward what you watched. I made myself dinner, usually something small, because cooking for one after 40 some years of cooking for a family had never stopped feeling strange to me. I went to bed. The next day, more or less the same thing happened again. I had people. I don't want you thinking I was some hermit. My daughter called on Sundays, mostly. I had a woman named Patricia I'd known since our children were small, and we'd have lunch some weeks. I went to church when I felt up to it. But there was an evening, I remember it clear as anything. It was a Wednesday. I'd gone to the grocery store for milk and a few other things, and driving home, I realized that the longest conversation I'd had all day was with the young man at the register. And it had consisted of him asking if I found everything I needed, and me saying yes, thank you, and him telling me to have a nice day. That was it. That was the conversation. I sat in my car in my own driveway for a minute before I went in, just thinking about that. I never would have called myself lonely. I still don't particularly. But something in me had gone quiet in a way I didn't much care for. And around that same time, I started reading things online retirement forums, mostly. People my age or thereabouts talking about stretching a fixed income further by living somewhere other than the United States. Portugal came up a lot. Mexico came up a lot. Ecuador. And then more than I expected, the Philippines. I'll admit my first reaction was skepticism, bordering on outright dismissal. I did not know one thing about the Philippines beyond the vaguest notion of where it was on a map. And I am not, generally speaking, a woman who takes big leaps based on strangers on the internet. But I kept reading. English widely spoken, which mattered to me. I was 77 years old at the time, and I was not about to go learn a new language from scratch. Cost of living considerably lower. A climate that was warm year-round, which after a lifetime of Georgia humidity didn't scare me the way it might scare some people. And there were whole threads of people my age and younger talking about a city called Dumaguete, specifically a university town. They said small, walkable, on the water, with a decent hospital and a community of other foreigners who'd settled there. I did not decide sitting at that kitchen table that I was moving to the Philippines. I want to be truthful about how this went. What I decided was that I would test it. I have never in my life made an irreversible decision without leaving myself a door to walk back out of. And I wasn't about to start at 78. I told myself 3 months. You go, you rent something short term, you see how your body and your mind and your wallet handle it. If you hate it, Georgia is still there. Georgia was not going anywhere. My daughter thought I'd lost my mind at first. Patricia thought I was having some kind of episode. But once I laid the numbers out for them plainly, the way I'd laid out budgets for the hospital board for 2.5 decades, they quieted down some. Numbers have a way of doing that to people. So I booked a 3-month stretch, arranged a short-term visa situation, the way the forums had told me to, and in the spring, I flew out of Atlanta with 2 suitcases and a carry-on and a feeling in my stomach I hadn't had in years, somewhere between excitement and the sense that I might be making the single dumbest decision of my life. Landing in Dumaguete did not feel like landing in paradise. I want to correct that expectation right now because I had half of one myself, buried somewhere under all my practicality. It felt like landing somewhere loud and hot and completely unfamiliar. The airport was small. The heat hit me the second the doors opened, thick and immediate. Nothing like Georgia heat, which at least you could brace for. There were motorcycles everywhere, not a few, everywhere, buzzing around like flies, sometimes with entire families balanced on the back of one. A father driving and a mother behind him holding a baby, and a child standing on the little platform in front, and nobody looking the least bit alarmed by this but me. The smells were different. Some of it was wonderful, something being grilled somewhere, sweet and smoky. Some of it was less wonderful, the smell of a drainage ditch, the smell of exhaust. The stores were different, small and packed close together. Hand-painted signs, a little grocery here, a hardware stall there, a woman selling something fried out of a cart with a line of school children around it. The rhythm of the place was different, faster in some ways and slower in others. And I stood outside my hotel that first evening, jet-lagged half out of my mind, and thought, what have you done, Dorothy? I liked some things immediately. I liked how everyone spoke English easily, comfortably, so that I never once felt lost in a conversation the way I'd half expected to. I liked the water, the sea was close, and even from a distance you could feel it cooling the air some. I liked the fruit, which was cheap and fresh in a way I hadn't had since I was a girl. I did not like the traffic, which seemed to follow rules I could not identify. I did not like how loud everything was, all the time, motorcycles and jeepneys and vendors calling out in music from somewhere. I found the apartment on my 3rd day through a local agent a woman on one of those forums had recommended. It was not fancy. I want to describe it honestly because I don't want you picturing something it wasn't. 1 bedroom with a window unit air conditioner that worked well enough once it got going. A simple kitchen 2 burners, a small refrigerator, not much counter space. A bathroom that did the job, nothing more. A little veranda out front, just big enough for 1 plastic chair and a small table where I could sit and watch the lane. An electric fan for the front room, since that part of the apartment had no air conditioning of its own. The internet was adequate, not fast, but adequate. The building itself was older. The houses along that lane built close together, closer than anything I was used to. Close enough that from my veranda I could have reached out and nearly touched the fence of the house next door. $450 a month, water included. I stood in that little front room with the agent, a pleasant young woman named Angel, and I did the math one more time in my head, the same math I'd been doing at my kitchen table in Georgia, and it came out even better than I'd hoped. I signed the 3-month lease right there. I remember walking back to my hotel that afternoon. I hadn't moved my things in yet, feeling something close to giddy, which is not a word I use about myself often. For about a day, I thought I had made an excellent decision. Then I met the people next door. Or rather, I didn't meet them, not properly, not that first day. I just started hearing them. I moved my 2 suitcases in on a Thursday afternoon, and by Thursday evening, I understood that the wall between my apartment and the house beside it was not doing the job a wall is supposed to do. I heard a television. I heard what I was fairly sure was a woman calling out to somebody to come eat. I heard distinctly laughter, a whole conversation's worth of laughter, back and forth, several voices. I sat on my little veranda that first evening with a cup of instant coffee because I hadn't found real coffee yet. And I watched people come and go from the house next door like it was a bus station. A man came home first, on foot, carrying what looked like groceries in a couple of thin plastic bags. He glanced my way, nodded, said something like, "Good evening, ma'am," friendly enough but not lingering on it, and went inside. That, I would learn over the following days, was June. Not long after, a woman came out onto their little section of yard and called something back into the house, then started fussing with what looked like a clothesline. That was Maria, though I didn't know her name yet either. And then, close to 8 o'clock, a motorcycle came roaring up the lane and stopped right outside, engine idling for what felt to me like an unreasonably long time before it finally cut off. And a young man swung off it and went inside without so much as a glance in my direction. That was Carlo, and I would come to recognize the particular pitch of that motorcycle's engine before I ever properly learned his name, which tells you something about how those first weeks went. There was a young woman, too, who I'd see leaving in the mornings and coming back in the evenings, always moving fast, always seeming to be running slightly late for something. That was Joy. I did not, in those early days, know any of this. I only knew that the house next door was never, ever quiet. There always seemed to be somebody outside, somebody cooking, somebody's radio playing, something with a beat to it, somebody's voice carrying through my thin wall at 9 o'clock at night when I was trying to read. By my second morning in that apartment, I was annoyed. By my third, I was Googling other apartments. By my fourth that morning I told you about, lying there at 6:08, listening to the gate and the motorcycle and the laughter, I had genuinely convinced myself I'd made a mistake. And I was 3 clicks away from arranging a viewing at a newer place I'd found, one that promised in its listing, quiet residential setting. I want to tell you honestly what was going through my mind in that first week, because I think it matters. I was not thinking, isn't it lovely, all this life happening around me? I was thinking, don't these people have anywhere else to be? I was thinking, back home, nobody would dream of running a motorcycle engine at 6 in the morning outside somebody's bedroom window. I was thinking that for $450, I had apparently bought myself a front row seat to somebody else's entire household, and nobody had mentioned that part in any of the online reviews. There was one particular morning, maybe my 6th or 7th day there, when I sat on my veranda with my coffee, real coffee by then. I'd found a little shop and I watched that motorcycle pull up and that same young man climb off it, and I thought, with more irritation than I'm proud of, that if that motorcycle had a social security number, I would have reported it to somebody, I don't know who, Somebody. I found the other apartment 2 days after that. It was in a newer building, maybe 15 minutes across town, closer to the water on one side and a quieter residential stretch on the other. $610 a month. $160 more than what I was paying, which was not nothing, but it was also well within what I could manage, especially against what I'd have been paying back in Georgia. The listing had photos, a proper kitchen with real counter space, a balcony with a view instead of a fence 4 feet away, a building that advertised itself again as quiet. I sent a message to the agent asking to see it. I did not see it right away, though. Life, as it does, got in the way, a small stomach upset that kept me close to home for a couple of days. Some paperwork I needed to sort out with my bank back home. The general business of getting settled into a new country. And in that stretch of days, something happened that I did not see coming and that I still think about. The power went out. It was an evening, maybe 2.5 weeks in. The heat that day had been especially bad, even by Dumagetti standards. The kind of heat that sits on you that makes the air itself feel heavy. I'd had my window unit running most of the afternoon and was grateful for it. And then around 7 in the evening, everything just stopped. The hum of the air conditioner cut off mid-breath. The lights went with it. My phone showed a full battery, but no Wi-Fi, of course, since the router had gone dark along with everything else. I sat there in the dark for a few minutes thinking it would come right back on, the way it sometimes does. It didn't. I opened a window thinking that might help, and it did not help, not one bit. If anything, the apartment felt hotter with the window open than it had with it shut, because at least shut, it had been holding on to some of the cooled air from earlier. Within maybe 20 minutes, I was properly miserable. The kind of miserable where you start sweating just sitting still. And I did something I hadn't done since I moved in. I went out onto my veranda, mostly because staying inside had become unbearable. The lane was dark, no street lights working either. And next door, I could hear the Reyes family, though I still didn't know that name yet, dealing with the same outage I was. Chairs scraping. Somebody's voice a little exasperated. A child's flashlight beam swinging around, though I'd later learn it wasn't a child, it was Joy, using her phone's light to find something. Somebody was eating outside, I could smell it. Something grilled, and I heard what sounded like Maria complaining good-naturedly about the timing of it all, and somebody else laughing in response. I stood on my side of that low fence for a good while, sweating, saying nothing, minding my own business the way I generally do. It was June who finally noticed me. He came around near the fence for some reason, checking a gutter maybe, or just moving in the dark trying to find a battery-powered lamp they had somewhere. And he saw me standing there in the near dark, and he said, "Easy as anything, Miss Dorothy. Cooler over here." I hadn't even realized he knew my name. I told him politely that I was fine, thank you, which was a lie, and I think we both knew it was a lie, because I was standing there with sweat running down my back and my blouse sticking to me. He didn't push it. He just said okay and went back to what he was doing. And I stood there another 5-10 minutes, feeling increasingly ridiculous, before I finally gave in to my own discomfort and walked around to their little gate. I want to be honest that I don't fully know why I did it. Pride is a strange thing at 78. I'd spent a career being the one who had answers, who solved other people's problems. And there was something almost physically uncomfortable about walking over to a stranger's yard because I was too hot to sit in my own apartment. But I did it. Nothing extraordinary happened after that, and I think that's actually the important part. Maria offered me a plastic chair, and I said no thank you at first, and then a minute later I said, well, all right, maybe just for a bit, and sat down. Somebody, I think it was Joy, offered me a piece of something, mango maybe, cut up on a plate that was going around. And I said, no, thank you again, and then changed my mind on that too. We talked, not about anything deep. June asked where in America I was from. And when I said Georgia, he said something about having a cousin who'd lived in Florida for a while. And we went back and forth a bit about the heat there versus the heat here, agreeing that ours was somehow worse despite being by the numbers probably cooler. Maria asked what I thought of the local food so far, and I admitted I hadn't tried much beyond what was easy. And she told me, without any fuss, a couple of dishes I ought to look for. Carlo made some joke about the electric company that I didn't fully catch the local reference on, but I laughed anyway because everyone else did, and Joy asked me, straightforward as anything, whether I had grandchildren, and I told her about my daughter's 2 boys back in Georgia. And she asked their ages and nodded along. Nobody made a speech about community. Nobody told me I was welcome or that I was family now or any of that. Nobody asked if I was lonely or pitied me or treated me like some poor old woman who'd wandered over from next door because she had nobody else. It was, if I am being completely accurate, a fairly unremarkable half hour of sitting in the dark with people I barely knew, talking about nothing in particular. And then the power came back on. I heard my own refrigerator hum back to life next door. That particular sound I'd already learned to recognize as mine. I assumed everyone would get up and go back inside, the way you do when the reason for a gathering disappears. Nobody moved. The conversation just kept going. Carlo said something about finishing charging his phone now, that the power was back. Maria said something about putting the leftover food away eventually, not yet. I sat there another 20 minutes or so, in a chair that wasn't mine, in a yard that wasn't mine, with people I'd known properly for less than an hour, and it did not feel strange the way I might have expected it to. It felt, oddly, like something I hadn't had in longer than I wanted to admit, which was simply being somewhere with people who weren't in any hurry for me to leave. I went back to my own apartment eventually, thanked them, said goodnight, and lay in my bed that night, turning the whole thing over. I did not decide anything, sitting there in the dark. I want to be clear about that, because these things don't happen the way they do in movies, all at once, with music behind them. I just noticed that I was thinking about it, replaying pieces of the conversation, which was more thinking than I'd done about another human being, in longer than I like to admit. The next morning, my alarm hadn't even gone off yet when I woke, same as always, right around 6. And there it was again, the gate, the voices, the kitchen sounds, and not long after, that motorcycle starting up and idling too long before finally pulling away down the lane. It was the exact same racket. I want to be honest about that too. I did not wake up one morning suddenly charmed by noise I'd found intolerable a week earlier. The sound itself hadn't changed one bit. But I lay there and I thought, that's June's voice, greeting somebody. That's Maria, probably already annoyed with somebody about something because she had a particular tone she used that I was starting to recognize. That's Carlo's motorcycle. I knew now. It took him roughly 45 seconds of idling before he actually pulled off. And I found myself almost against my will timing it. That laugh, further off, that was Joy, heading out for whatever she did during her days, which I still didn't fully know. I still wanted quiet. I want to be honest about that too, because I don't want you thinking I turned into some different woman overnight who'd suddenly decided she loved chaos. I did not. Some part of me, lying there that morning, still thought, Lord, could these people not manage a slightly quieter departure? But underneath the irritation, there was something else now, something that hadn't been there 4 mornings earlier, which was that the noise had names attached to it. It had faces. It wasn't just racket anymore. It was June and Maria and Carlo and Joy going about their Tuesday, same as I was about to go about mine. I did not cancel my viewing of the $610 apartment. I want to be truthful about the order of things. I still went about a week and a half after that power outage on a Thursday afternoon. But between that night in the dark and the viewing, a fair amount of ordinary life happened. And I think it's worth telling some of it, because the story isn't really about one dramatic evening. It's about a great many small ones. I started asking Maria things. Where do you get decent chicken around here? I asked her one afternoon when I ran into her coming back from somewhere with bags in her hands. And she pointed me toward a wet market a few streets over that I never would have found on my own, and told me, bluntly, which vendor to avoid because he weighted his scale wrong. June, a few days after that, noticed me struggling with a cabinet door in my kitchen that had come loose from its hinge because I'd left my own door open trying to get some cross breeze going. And he came by the next evening with a screwdriver and fixed it in about 4 minutes, waving off my attempt to pay him for his trouble, though I did make him take some of the mangoes I'd bought that week, which felt like a fair enough trade to both of us. Joy one Saturday caught me standing outside a little pharmacy looking thoroughly confused by a form I was supposed to fill out for something related to my residency paperwork. And she just walked over, read it over my shoulder without asking, and told me plainly what half the boxes meant, since apparently even she found the wording confusing. Carlo, of all people, was the one who ended up giving me directions the first time I tried taking a tricycle somewhere on my own and got thoroughly turned around. He happened to be passing on his motorcycle, recognized me standing on a corner looking lost, and pulled over just long enough to point me the right way and tell the driver where I needed to go in the local dialect, then took off again before I'd even properly thanked him. None of these were long conversations. Some days it was nothing more than "Morning, Miss Dorothy," as somebody passed by, and that was the whole exchange. Some days we didn't speak at all, because everyone had their own life happening. June had his work, whatever it was exactly, something to do with a small transport business I never got the full details of. Maria seemed to run half the household and half the neighborhood's business besides, always somewhere, always doing 3 things. Carlo worked somewhere across town and came and went at odd hours. Joy had her own job and her own friends and her own life that had nothing to do with the elderly American woman next door. I want to underline that, because I think it's easy for a story like this to make it sound like a family adopted a lonely old woman, and that is not what happened. They did not adopt me. They had their own bills, their own arguments, I heard, more than once, some disagreement or another through that thin wall. Nothing dramatic. Just the ordinary friction of people who live close together and love each other and occasionally get on each other's nerves. They had relatives who came and went, cousins, and an uncle I gathered lived not too far off, and I was not included in any of that. Not really, not at first. I was the neighbor. A friendly one, gradually, but a neighbor. I also want to be honest that the Philippines itself did not turn into paradise during those weeks. I still found the heat oppressive some afternoons. I got my first real bout of homesickness on a rainy Sunday about a month in, sitting in my apartment, listening to the rain hammer, the tin roof somewhere nearby, missing, of all things, a particular grocery store back in Georgia that I'd never once thought I cared about. I had a genuinely frustrating afternoon at a government office trying to sort out some paperwork extension, standing in a line that didn't seem to move for the better part of 2 hours, in heat that made me want to sit down right there on the floor. I had a misunderstanding at a little shop where I thought I was buying one thing and ended up with something else entirely. and stood there for a good minute trying to work out, in my very rusty patience, how to explain the mistake without seeming rude about it. Dumagetti did not go out of its way to make things easy for me. It simply went on being itself, and I was the one adjusting to it, same as anybody adjusting to any place new. So by the time that Thursday afternoon came around and I went to see the $610 apartment, I was not walking in with rose-colored glasses about my new life. I was walking in as a practical woman looking at a practical decision. And the apartment, I have to say, was genuinely better. I don't want to pretend otherwise because that would ruin the honesty of the whole thing. It was newer, built maybe 5 or 6 years back, instead of whatever considerably older vintage my current building was. The kitchen had real counter space, a proper stove instead of my 2 little burners. The bedroom had its own small balcony with a view out toward some trees instead of a chain link fence 4 feet from my veranda. And it was quiet. I stood in that empty apartment during the viewing, and I could hear almost nothing from outside a car passing somewhere in the distance. Birds, nothing more. The agent, a pleasant enough young man, asked me plainly whether I wanted to move forward with it. 3 weeks earlier, I would have said yes on the spot, no hesitation at all. I remember standing there in that quiet apartment and expecting myself to say yes, expecting the word to come out easily the way it always had for me my whole practical, decisive life. It didn't come. I told him I needed a little time to think it over, which surprised him some, I think, because I'd been fairly clear on the phone beforehand that I was looking to move soon. He said that was fine. The unit would likely be available for another couple of weeks at least. I thanked him and left, and I walked around outside for a while afterward instead of heading straight home, which is not something I typically do, because I did not entirely understand my own hesitation, and I wanted to think it through before I got back to a place where I'd have to explain myself to nobody but my own 4 walls. I want to try to describe what I figured out on that walk, because it took me a while to put words to it, even in my own head. When I'd first been comparing apartments weeks earlier, sitting with my laptop doing what I do best, which is careful, practical comparison, I had made a list, more or less, of what mattered. Rent, square footage, whether the air conditioning worked well, internet speed, kitchen space, privacy, how close it was to the market, to a pharmacy, to the water. I had never once, not on a single one of those lists, written down anything about what existed on the other side of a wall or a fence. It had never occurred to me that it was a category worth considering, the way you wouldn't think to ask a hotel about the personalities of the housekeeping staff before booking a room. But walking home that afternoon past the little shop where Maria had told me to avoid the dishonest vendor, past the corner where Carlo had once stopped his motorcycle just long enough to point me in the right direction, I understood that I had been measuring the wrong things, or at least an incomplete set of things. Rent mattered. Square footage mattered. But apparently, and this genuinely surprised me about myself, so did the sound of a gate I recognized and a motorcycle I could identify with my eyes shut, and a woman calling out to somebody to come eat, even when that somebody wasn't me. I did not decide that afternoon to stay. I want to be honest that it took a bit longer than one walk, but something had shifted in how I was thinking about the whole decision. And I noticed it, the way you notice a change in the weather before you could tell anybody exactly what changed. Not long after, maybe a few days later, I had one of my regular Sunday calls with my daughter back in Georgia, and my old friend Patricia happened to be visiting her that weekend, so I ended up talking to the both of them for a while, passing the phone back and forth the way we do. Patricia asked me, in that direct way she's always had since we were young women, how the cheap apartment was working out. Still noisy, I told her, which was the truth. I told her about the motorcycle, about the general racket next door, half complaining the way I'd been complaining in my head that first week. Then, why on earth haven't you moved? Patricia asked me. She'd known about the quieter apartment because I'd mentioned it to her weeks earlier, practically already decided on it. I remember sitting there with the phone against my ear and not having a tidy answer ready. That was unusual for me. I have generally my whole life had an answer ready for most things people ask me, but I sat there for a second too long, long enough that my daughter in the background said something like, "Mama, you still there?" I said something about not having gotten around to it yet, about paperwork being a hassle, about not wanting to deal with moving in this heat. All true in their way, but none of them were the actual reason. And I think Patricia heard that in my voice because she gave a little laugh and said something like, the way she does when she's decided not to push a thing, but wants me to know she's noticed it. She didn't explain me to myself. Neither did my daughter. I don't think either of them fully understood what was going on with me any better than I did. And I hadn't fully admitted it to myself yet either, so there wasn't much anybody could say. We moved on to other things, my grandsons, some news from back home, and the conversation ended the way it always did, warm and ordinary. But I sat with that unanswered question of Patricia's for the rest of the evening. My original 3-month lease came due not too long after that call. The landlord, a soft-spoken man I'd only met once when I signed the lease, sent word through Angel, the agent, asking whether I intended to renew. I sat down that evening with a piece of paper, the old-fashioned way I've always done my important thinking, and wrote the 2 options out plainly, the way I'd have laid out a budget proposal for a hospital board 30 years earlier. Option A, $450 a month. Older building, smaller, noisier, less private. Next door to June, Maria, Carlo, and Joy. Option B, $610 a month. Newer building, larger, quieter, more private. A difference of $160 a month. I looked at that number for a long while. I could afford either one. I want to say that plainly because I don't want anybody thinking I stayed in that noisy apartment because I had no other choice, because I was too poor to do otherwise. That wasn't it at all. $17.20 a month stretched considerably further here than it ever had back home. And $160, while not nothing, was not going to break me. This was a genuine choice made with a genuine alternative sitting right there in front of me, fully within reach. I did not make the decision that night. I slept on it, the way I generally do with anything that matters. But sometime in the days after, without any particular ceremony, without any dramatic moment where the music swells, I found myself telling Angel that I'd be renewing the lease on the $450 apartment. No grand speech, no emotional unraveling. I simply told her, yes, I'd like to stay, and she said she'd let the landlord know, and that was that. A day or 2 later, I ran into June out near the gate, both of us coming back from somewhere at more or less the same time. He asked, casual as anything, the way you'd ask somebody about the weather, "You staying, Miss Dorothy?" "Looks like it," I told him. "Good," he said. And that was the whole exchange. He went on inside probably to whatever he'd been about to do before he ran into me, and I went into my own apartment, and neither of us made anything more of it than that. I think if he'd made a bigger deal of it, honestly, it would have felt wrong. It would have turned into something it wasn't. What it was 2 neighbors briefly acknowledging an ordinary piece of news and then both going back to their evenings. That evening, sitting in my own apartment, after that little exchange with June, I could hear, same as always, life happening on the other side of my wall, the gate opening and closing as somebody came or went, chairs being moved around outside, the clatter of dishes being washed or put away. Voices, Maria's and Joy's, I thought, going back and forth about something I couldn't quite make out and didn't need to. Somebody was cooking, I could smell it through my window, something with garlic in it, something good. And underneath it all, right on cue, that motorcycle, Carlos, pulling up and idling those familiar 45 seconds before finally cutting off. It was, near enough as I could tell, the exact same collection of sounds that had greeted me on my fourth morning in that apartment. The sounds that had sent me straight to my phone, searching for somewhere quieter to live. I sat there a while, in my chair by the front window, and I noticed my hand had gone toward the window, like I was about to close it, out of old habit, the way I'd closed it most nights those first couple of weeks, trying to shut some of that noise out so I could hear myself think. I left it open. I sat there a good while longer, listening to all of it, the gate, the dishes, the voices, that motorcycle finally pulling away down the lane into the evening. And I thought about the question I'd come here to answer in the first place, which was a fairly plain and practical one. Whether $1,720 a month could buy an old woman a little more breathing room than it had been buying her back home. The apartment had answered that question clearly enough. $450 a month, water included, had done exactly what I'd hoped it would do, financially speaking. That part of the experiment had worked out just as tidily as I'd planned it, sitting at my kitchen table in Georgia all those months back, doing the arithmetic that had started this whole thing. But no listing I'd ever looked at, not that first apartment, nor the newer, quieter one I'd nearly taken instead, had mentioned the thing that actually made me sign that renewal. Nobody writes that into a listing. There's no line item for it, no square footage, no monthly cost. It isn't the sort of thing you can measure with a spreadsheet, though Lord knows I tried in my own way, laying out those two options on a sheet of paper like a woman comparing insurance plans. I sat by that open window a good while longer than I usually did, listening to the ordinary noise of somebody else's Tuesday evening happening close enough that I could feel it, and I did not try to name what exactly had changed, or put a word to what had kept me there when a better, quieter, more private option had been sitting right in front of me the whole time. Some things I've found don't hold up well to being named out loud. They just are what they are, and you either notice them or you don't. And I suppose somewhere between that fourth morning and this one, I had started to notice.